Move on to our next item. I would like to welcome David Cox, Association of the Residential Letting Agents, and also Douglas Haig, Residential Landlords Association. This is regarding the item of the consideration of the draft code of practice for private rented sector landlords and agents. So can I welcome you both? We've had time to look at the written responses, so if we can go straight into questions, that would be helpful. I just want to start off. Regarding this code of code of practice. What is your view? I mean, do you think it's fit for purpose?
From our perspective, probably not. No.
Right.
There's quite a lot of work that still needs to be done around it, both in terms of the structure, presentation, and a reasonable amount of the content to go forwards.
We take a slightly different view, but that is predominantly because there are already an awful lot of codes of practice that exist within the lettings world. This code seems in large part to have been taken from the Property Ombudsman, the TPO's code, the RICS Blue Book, and last year's PRS code, as well as ARLA's old code of practice, which is very much based and designed for letting agents. And therefore, we don't really have an objection to it, because it is merely a high-level version of the much more detailed codes that we require of our members and letting agents to adhere to. And therefore, we see it as fit for purpose for letting agents, but not necessarily for landlords.
Okay. Well, I know members will have specific issues that they want to draw. Sorry, Alan?
Said that you have, or we have, I think, codes of conduct. You do mean the Association of Residential Letting Agents, your organisation, so that letting agents who are members agree to abide by those individual codes. It might be useful if Mr. Cox were to write to us with a copy of those codes so we can actually understand what they are.
Well, our code, we actually, because there are already a number of codes within the sector, ARLA had its own code of practice until last year. At the end of last year, we decided to dispense with our code of practice to try and reduce the number of codes in the sector, and merely replaced it with the Property Ombudsman's code. So whatever the Property Ombudsman's code for lettings is at any given time is our code of practice.
Okay.
So as is the TPO code.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Just to add to that, Chair, as well, the Residential Landlords Association has its own code as well for its members, but obviously the percentage of members that we have, we want to be able to apply a much broader code. And that, I think what Dave has already mentioned about the sheer volume of codes that are out there is actually one of our major concerns that we have around the establishment of yet another code which doesn't quite blend with everything else that exists.
Okay. Thank you. Jocelyn?
There are many landlords that are not a member of anything, so they won't be using any code, I suppose, at the minute, will they? Only statutory requirement. So what engagement have you had in the development of the code? Have you had any direct, other than responding to the consultation?
I think both of our organisations sat on the Welsh Government's working group.
Right, okay, so you were involved at the beginning. Is there anything that you would like to see taken out? Which one? Should we start with you, David?
Actually, no. This is actually the highest level code that is being discussed at the moment. The PRS code, which we recommended, should be the base for any Welsh code that was developed by the industry and supported by DCLG and launched actually in Newport by the Housing Minister last September, should have been the basis of the code. Now, even that code is nowhere near as detailed as the Property Ombudsman's code, and neither should it be for a high-level statutory code. And therefore, because there's already probably in this code about 40 or 50 pages stripped out from the Ombudsman's code, it's really the high-level musts and shoulds, not the much more detailed work that goes in.
Douglas, is there anything you'd take out?
Yes, I suppose. It's the way that the code is designed we're concerned about. So
Not the content.
some of the content we do have an issue with, and that does bring me back to some of the consultation process. But if I can answer the first question. Really, I suppose what we see it as is that there's a lot of reference to already statutory obligations. We're concerned about the repetition of the statutory obligations, and we feel that really around the code should highlight what those statutory obligations are and refer them to alternative guidance, as opposed to trying to repeat it all within the code. And that actually we should be looking at what best practice is and bringing up the standards that way, as opposed to just repeating statutory obligations. There is another concern around, and I think we have to understand that there's a big difference between a code which applies directly to a landlord and a code that applies to an agent. Now, I'm aware of the TPO code. I think it's a very good code of practice. I don't think that it's not particularly, it doesn't cover landlords specifically.
That's not the audience for that
That's
code.
not the audience for that code. So what we feel, and so there's an area that's covered by the CMA guidance, which there's an 83 or 93-page document around the CMA guidance, which allows coverage of the consumer protection regulations. What's happened is a lot of those have been included in the code. So it's codifying things which are really just guidance elsewhere. Now, that's an excellent, the CMA guidance is an excellent document as well. So instead of, again, repeating a lot of work and a lot more detail is in the CMA guidance than in the code, I think that we should actually be removing those items from the code and saying this should be referred to in the CMA document. So actually what we're looking at is really, here's where you find lots of information about what your statutory obligations are. Here's lots of guidance for you around that, which is written and updated by the relevant bodies. And here's a list of best practice, which is very easy to understand. So that's how we would like to see the code structured.
Okay, so is there any of the content other than what you'd be obliged to, that you would be subject to that's found elsewhere? Is there any of the content that you'd want to take out? Is there anything in there you don't agree with then?
I think maybe some of the timescales and some of the corrections. There's a lot of detail. I mean, I could go through probably 2 or 3 pages of things where I would say, well, actually, in practical terms, this is not practical. For instance, as an example, being able to having to check a property within 24 hours of a property being made vacant. Now, if you've got one property, then that's okay. But if you've got 10 and they're all student properties and they all vacate on the same day, it's going to take you 4 hours or so to do one of the larger student properties. So there's just no way you can do that within 24 hours.
Because the code tries to cover all sorts of different sorts of landlords, but there are some that would find this very difficult, practically difficult, because of that. And that's one example, student accommodation, and you may have several student flats. Yeah.
So I suppose what we would like to do is be able to actually, and we have fed it into our response, a number of the items, but to be able to go through and discuss them with the committee that's putting the code together and say, that's just not practical as it stands. We would like to see this, and like the landlord's address, if it's being managed by an agent, then it should really be allowable to be the address to be of an agent as opposed to the landlord's personal address. But that's not allowable within the code the way it's written.
So you're saying that it might not be appropriate in every case for every tenant to know your home personal address?
Yes.
The same as being contactable at any time?
Yes.
I noticed that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. So it's not huge changes, but
many,
practical changes.
But there are many objections. You've got many objections to be. Okay, thanks.
Okay, I got a supplementary from Alan.
Thank you. That's quite interesting and an entirely reasonable point. It begs a question to me as what the process was in drawing up this code, because what you've just said is perfectly fair, perfectly reasonable, and I would have anticipated would be a part of this. So I think, Mr. Cox, you did indicate that you were involved in drawing up the code. Were you, Mr. Haig?
Yes, there was two groups.
Okay, so you were involved. Could you describe, the process of drawing up a code from a point at which you were first involved with it to where we are today?
It stemmed from the stakeholder groups that were meeting on a bi-monthly, quarterly basis. It got to the point where the code of practice was in discussion. It was it's quite detailed discussions that weren't particularly practical for every member around the table. So it was decided to split into two groups. One is discuss the training provisions. I'm not a training expert, so I didn't attend that panel. And the code of practice was another group. That only met twice, and the discussions were really broadly on the purpose of the code, really, as opposed to any detail of the code. And it was decided to adopt a code, the RICS code, that had been drawn together just the year before, wasn't it, as a starting point?
It was, and the group met twice. It was very much the initial discussions, and I think the last time it met was, I was going to say October last year, September, October last year. We then have had no further involvement on any of the provisions relating to the Housing Wales Act since then. The Welsh Government went, I'm afraid, completely quiet on us. No further stakeholder groups were arranged. And at that point, we were discussing the private rented sector code had just been launched a few weeks before. We were suggesting that should be the basis of the code. We've had no further direct discussions and certainly no stakeholder groups with the Welsh Government since that. And
so did you at any point see a draft of this?
We saw a draft of the consultation document, and we commented on the draft of the consultation document.
Right, okay. Sorry, just a point really, because when I asked earlier your involvement, it sounded quite good.
Yeah,
and I'm sure,
I'm
sure when we spoke to the minister, she'd say, oh, they were involved in drawing.
There were two. We had the initial discussion. Then there was, I would say, probably about a 6-month lag where we heard nothing. We got the consultation document for comments probably 3 weeks before the consultation was actually launched. And I would note that the Welsh Government did take on board a lot of the points that I certainly made on the first draft, the draft that we saw, and the consultation document itself did contain many of the points that I'd raised a few weeks before.
Was it the same for you, Douglas?
We wrote to the Minister and the team working on it, and we had a response. It wasn't at that point on the detail of the document. It was more about how the document was going to be structured. And I will say that overall in the Housing Wales, as the Housing Wales Bill progressed, whilst there was consultation, I don't feel that very many of the points of view of many of the people around the table were taken on board through the whole process, which was disappointing.
You wrote to the Minister, to the Government. Would it be possible for us to have a copy of our correspondence?
Yes.
Yeah,
As I say, it was less about the actual physical content of the bill, of the code, and more about the purpose and how it should be structured. But yes, certainly I can.
But have you? I'm grateful to you for that. Have you an alternative code or a list of amendments that you'd like to see to it?
We have. Yes. It needs to be tidied up, but certainly it's only been working on it from this perspective. But we have proposed alternatives to that.
And it would be useful, I think, if you were able to share that with us at an appropriate time.
Okay, no problem.
Okay, Mark.
Largely actually answered the questions allocated formally to me. How will the code interact with other codes of practice? Largely exhausted that. But how do you believe, if at all, the code will make any difference to agents who are already members of professional bodies and subject to codes of conduct, if at all?
I'm afraid to say it won't have any impact at all, because both RICS and RLA hold their members to much higher requirements to that which is in this code. The RICS have their own blue book, which is their code of practice, which is as equally detailed and very similar to the Property Ombudsman's code, which we hold our members to. So for the actual professional bodies, I'm afraid it's not going to have any impact at all. Having said that, in England, and we are hoping in Wales as well, there will become a requirement to join one of the 3 government authorised redress schemes, or however many redress schemes you choose to authorise in Wales. Only the TPO has a code of practice. The other 2 authorised schemes in England, which is the Property Redress Scheme and Ombudsman Services Property, don't have their own codes of practice, and therefore use the high-level private rented sector code that was launched by DCLG last year, which is similar but slightly more detailed to this. So it really is only the professional bodies that hold their members to a much higher standard.
Could I put the same question to Mr. Haig regarding landlords?
Well, I mean, in terms of our personal members, it shouldn't make a huge amount of difference because we have a code of practice in place already. But as I think Jocelyn pointed out earlier, that many landlords aren't members of professional bodies, so therefore they're not currently complying with any sort of code of practice. I think that if it's made very clear that actually this is following the code of practice is part of your licence condition, it does tend to focus one's mind on making sure that some of these things are there to follow. So really, actually, and we've said it before, if everybody was complying with what was laid out there, then we would have very few problems in the sector. It's about making sure that there is an education programme out there, and it's not just about the training, but it is about disseminating information that this exists in the first place, and that's our real concern once this gets going. And then, of course, enforcement. It's not going to do anything if it's not enforced.
I couldn't agree more with you on that one. I suppose the one point I would make is that at the moment, the statutory guidance that the courts use to interpret housing law is the 2002 rent-only code. Now, by its very name, an awful lot of legislation has passed since the 2002 rent-only code came into force. It doesn't take account of anything in the Housing Act 2004, licensing, and again won't take into account the Housing Wales Act. We take the view that it is totally unenforceable at this point in time and totally inadequate. Why we've been pushing the Housing Minister in England to use the PRS code from last year and replace it as statutory guidance that the courts use to interpret the housing law as the overarching code for the sector, and the professional bodies use the more detailed RICS Blue Book or the TPO code to enforce against their members. In Wales, you are also using the 2002 rent-only code, so something does need to be replaced because it is just totally inadequate for what it is there to do.
And on this theme, given the objectives of the code, will this make any difference specifically to the landlords who are creating the biggest problems, the minority of bad or criminal landlords, given the existing codes that already apply?
In my opinion, not hugely, because it's about enforcing what's already there and educating and making sure people are aware of it. So it does make, I suppose, it makes it clearer in terms of a reference point, which is nice to have. But it's what you do with it. You'll have the tool there, then it's what you do with it afterwards.
Can I just make, because obviously you said for the sort of worst end now, it is a reference point. So I mean, obviously I understand the enforcement. I mean, it's always important to enforce these things. But you think that for that end, this is a reference point, and it could help. Is that what you're saying? Or
certainly as a document that brings together a lot of housing legislation and allows people to reference it and say, right, okay, well, I need to comply with that, and I need to comply with that, and it's quite a minefield trying to understand all of the areas that you are supposed to comply with. So, if that document exists, then that's certainly a good starting point. And ultimately, breach of the code means that you can revoke a licence. There's a way of enforcement there.
Okay, I got John and then Jocelyn.
I was just going to ask David, actually, in terms of agents who are already members of professional bodies with their own codes of practice, would you have any idea of the numbers of agents in Wales that are not in that category?
I'm afraid I can't do Wales specifically. I'm afraid we break Wales up into 3 different regions for our membership statistics, and it does, I'm afraid, pull into England as well in those 3 regions. So whilst I have tried, I'm afraid for me it's purely an estimate. We have over 7,000 agent branches, over 8,000 members in the UK. Unfortunately, there are no stats on how many agents there are. Based on the portal's statistics, Rightmove, Zoopla, and On the Market, we estimate there are somewhere between sort of 12 and 16,000 agent offices in the UK, which means we have about 50 to 60% of all agents within RLA membership. Then, of course, there's RICS and there is NOWS as the other 2 professional bodies. So I would estimate that there are approximately 60 to 70% of all agents are members of one of the professional bodies. It's actually one of the reasons why we were extremely disappointed the Assembly removed what we thought was one of the most important clauses of the Housing Wales Bill at the 11th hour. And I think it was the day that the bill passed last year that removed a clause requiring agents to be members of one of the professional bodies. Now, we've never really got to the bottom of why that was removed. It was in the intention, it was in the bill all the way up to the day the bill actually passed. But what that removed was the professional bodies, all of the professional bodies hold their members to specific standards: independent auditing of client accounts, client money protection, membership of redress scheme, ongoing continued professional development, and the training requirements that are still in the bill. But that removed all of those, and therefore they are no longer on the face. They're not on the face of the Act, and unless they are brought in by some other measure, and we are very much pushing that you bring them in by some other measure, all the safeguards that consumers, both landlords and tenants, have from agents of the professional body that was on the face of the bill when introduced into the Senedd were removed literally on the 11th hour, and we would very much push, and we have pushed the Welsh Minister to put those back in.
Perhaps
Jocelyn then Alice.
I just wondered whether that's something then we could pursue with the Minister to find out what the rationale for that omission was, and whether Welsh Government has any plans to introduce those requirements.
Yes.
What I was going to make you see was removed by amendment to
Yes,
the bill. Was it amendment proposed by who?
I think it was a ministerial amendment.
Right.
That's fine.
Okay, Jocelyn?
I just wondered if, the code, like, a bit like the highway code, then if there is a dispute in the court or in a tribunal, if you're in breach of the code, liability is often found against you. So won't this be used as, even if it doesn't change sort of day-to-day behaviour in a radical way, that if there are disputes, won't this code be the thing that aids judges and magistrates and so on in deciding who's in the right and who's in the wrong?
This is where the statutory part of it comes into force. At the moment, unless this is made a statutory code, the courts will be interpreting housing legislation based on the 2002 rent-only code rather than this, or whatever you choose to create. If you make this a statutory code, the courts will interpret housing legislation based on this. And something that is in the private rented sector code, which at the moment is guidance, it's not statutory guidance for the court. It does say that the best practice elements will be expected by a court unless landlord or agent can demonstrate, I can't remember the exact wording, but something like an objective justification for why they haven't undertaken the best practice requirements. Now, we would again say that any code that you produce should become statutory guidance for the courts to interpret.
Just an observation, given Haig's comments about the omission from the bill on the final day. Some of those matters, such as continuous professional development, were also excluded from the regulations which the Assembly passed on Tuesday. So it has the implications already fed down.
Okay.
I'm afraid I didn't know that, but may I make one point on that one? With the fact that Douglas and I were both sitting before you a few weeks ago on the renting homes bill, if there was no requirement under this piece of legislation for ongoing development and CPD, then agents and landlords are going to need to get trained in old law, and we're talking probably this coming in later in the year, 12 months to get trained before enforcement starts. So by the end of next year, agents and landlords will need to get trained on the law as it stands today, which is then likely to change if the Housing Wales Bill becomes the Renting Homes Bill becomes the Renting Homes Act, at which point you will entirely change the legislative requirements of tenancy law with no requirement for the agents and the landlords to know what it is. It beggars belief, quite honestly.
Very interesting. Peter, do you want to go on to your main question?
I'm just trying to get to the bottom of this not being a statutory code, because this code was issued under Section 40 of the Act. Given that it's actually a code issued under the Act, in what way is it not statutory?
I'm afraid I do not know the exact legal processes, but what we would advocate is it needs to be made statutory guidance, so the courts are required to consider it when enforcing housing legislation. At the moment, even the PRS code issued by DCRG last year is not something that the courts will use to interpret housing legislation.
So the Act will actually have to say this is statutory guidance in the Act?
I'm afraid you would need to ask a constitutional lawyer
we get
that
some
question.
advice.
I don't know the answer.
We'll get some advice now.
Yeah, we will get advice.
Okay. My question relates to the Competition Market Authority, which you've already touched on, and how it interacts with the guidance of letting professionals. Can you expand on that, on the differences and the issues around that?
It's probably best if we talk about it from a landlord's and an agent's point of view. So for an agent, the CMA guidance is required because they are dealing with consumers.
Yeah.
And under the case, the Office of Fair Trading versus Foxtons from a few years ago, if a landlord is using an agent, a landlord is classed as a consumer in that situation, and obviously a tenant is classed as a consumer in that situation. The CMA guidance and the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regulations of 2008 wiped away the concept of caveat emptor, buyer beware.
Right.
It is now a requirement for agents to tell prospective tenants everything they need to know in order to make an informed transactional decision. Now, the guidance from last year is almost 100 pages long. It's ambiguous in many ways. It's not clear, and it's one of the reasons we've actually created a primary authority scheme to try and assist agents in navigating and having regulatory certainty by being issued assured advice from their primary authority.
And that's UK government guidance because it's to do with consumers?
No, it's EU. It's from the EU, therefore it applies across all.
It's not Wales.
The guidance, it's come out from the Competition Markets Authority. It is different for landlords because landlords, there is no definition of when a landlord stops being a consumer and starts being a business in UK law at all. And therefore, does a landlord have to comply with the CMA guidance as a business or not? Are they a landlord? Are they a consumer? Are they a business? For agents, it does need to go in the code because it's a fundamental shift in law that, although it happened in 2008, it's not being enforced particularly well at the moment, but it does hold an unlimited fine. And it's actually one of the few offences in housing law that holds an unlimited fine, and it is important that consumers are aware of what they are taking on. Just to give you an example of some of the assured advice, and it's something that I go and I actually ask agents whenever I meet them at our regional meetings, do you need to tell a prospective tenant if somebody has died in a property? And it's interesting the responses because I start with yes, no, and then it depends. And the advice that we've had from our primary authority, which our agents use, is it does depend. If somebody has been murdered or has committed suicide in the property, then yes, you do need to. But our primary authority took the view that an awful lot of our housing stock is quite old, and therefore it's reasonable that a few people have died of natural causes in a Tudor house over the centuries. Therefore, if they died of natural causes, you don't need to tell a prospective tenant.
Possibly there may be murdered in Tudor times in that property.
So, exactly. It is very confusing. There's very little case law on the consumer protection regulations, but it's something that has to go into a code for an agent. Whether it has to go into a code for a landlord, I'm not sure, and I would probably say in the vast majority of cases it doesn't.
So in terms of the status of this guidance, presumably it sits alongside this code, and presumably if the licensing requirements of the Housing Act, the Housing Wales Act, in terms of training, that training will cover that particular code?
It would need to.
Yeah.
It's a significant part of what an agent does. In fact, it pervades every part of what an agent does. If an agent makes a mistake and doesn't provide the necessary information, then that does bring the whole question of the legitimacy of the tenancy into account.
And how aware are landlords of this?
Well, I think this is something that's been missed throughout the development of the whole Housing Wales Act is really just how different the letting agent and the landlord markets are. They seem to be lumped together, and I've constantly banged my head saying that we need to be looking at them differently. So what we've got is a mishmash of requirements which probably doesn't suit either market, and really should have been treated independently, because what David's talking about, one of the relationships that hasn't really been examined through is actually the relationship between the landlord and the agent.
Yeah.
Because most of it has been landlord-agent and the tenant as a relationship, and actually there's quite a complex relationship between the landlord and the agent, certainly when it comes down to responsibility and who is actually responsible for things. And throughout the whole process this has been ignored, and it comes down to the training as well. I mean, we've got a whole section there which predominantly landlords don't need to know, except for enforcing their rights if they're dealing with an agent, and that's trying to be lumped together as if you were the same people doing the same job, and you're absolutely not. There's such a difference, and I think that's part of the problem with agents at the moment. There's a lot of agents start because they're landlords, thinking, oh, I'll start managing other people's properties, and they really don't realise the massive gulf there is between running properties for other people and running something for yourself. And that's something that I would really like to see looked at as we progress this.
Okay, if we can move on now to Janet.
We've talked about the clarity of the draft code and how it could be improved. Anything further to add on that?
And the only thing I would say on this is it is a well-drafted code. It's well written, it's clear and easy to understand, and particularly, when you think of something like the TPO code, which is much more detailed, although it is exceptionally well written as well, I think a few tenants will find it difficult to navigate the TPO code, whereas a tenant should be able to understand it relatively simply and understand their rights, responsibilities of their landlords and their agents. So from that perspective, I do actually think it's a very well written document. One of the things that we put in the sort of pre-consultation consultation was it was originally 2 documents, a legal one and a best practice one. One of the things we suggested to the Welsh Government is it should be 1 document so that everything's in the same place, which is what came out in the consultation document. So that was one thing that I would probably have raised with the committee if they hadn't already acted on it.
I agree in the sense that if you refer to the TPO code, this code is much easier to read. But I think that if we're talking about real consumers here, understanding it, because we want not just landlords, but we want tenants to read this, to know what their landlord should be doing. I know we're looking at possibly how to rent guides and things like that, but actually we want to be able to encourage access to this code for tenants. So I do think it needs a lot of thought. So certainly in terms of the layout, some of the language is technical still for both landlords and tenants coming into it if you're a new landlord. If you're at an agent's level, you should be knowing these things by the time you're getting to the level of an agent. So I can understand where David's coming from entirely, but from really the consumer level into the code. And the layout needs to be changed. Certainly having 2 sections within it where you keep bouncing backwards and forwards, I think it needs to be altered. And I would like to see the agent obligations stripped and put in a section at the back, so that actually the landlord is more clearly identifiable for tenants, landlords and agents, exactly who's responsible for what, because sometimes it just says L, but who is the L responsible to, and it says A, and who is the A responsible to. Actually the A is responsible to the landlord in this case and not to the tenant in this case, and it's a little complex like that. So,
would it help to explain how the PRS code is created? And that was actually, it was the Secretary of State ordered RICS and the working group to create this code last year on behalf of the whole industry. So we had a significant number of working groups and meetings, discussions last year, and that's actually exactly how the PRS code itself is now created. Each section, so viewings, etc., property conditions, has the legal requirements at the top, followed by the best practice guidance, and then followed by a sort of shaded area that says for agents only. So it separates out, this is what is required for landlords and agents in legal and best practice, and then for agents you're expected to do this bit on top. Now, I would agree with Douglas, the entire industry, including the tenant groups, everybody was involved in that, in the construction of the PRS code that was signed off and launched by DCRG and the Housing Minister last year. Everybody thought that was the most logical way of putting it. It's why I can understand this, the fact that the Welsh Government has chosen to separate law and best practice into two sections. I can understand the logic, but I would probably agree with Douglas that it's probably more sensible putting the two bits together in each section.
And is there a need to replicate statutory requirements in the code?
I would say yes, there is, because it's then that single reference source with maybe links to more detailed information. I think on the consumer protection regulations, for example, what the PRS code says is that agents have to comply with the consumer protection for unfair trading regulations. The CMA issued guidance. The guidance is at this link. So it's sort of a couple of lines as opposed to actually replicating the guidance in the code.
We'd rather see the statutory obligations referred to and then pointed to guidance, because each of those sections of statutory obligations are going to be pretty hefty. And I think that actually if you're either going to try to cover it all, and it's going to be a huge document that no one's going to read, or you don't cover it enough, and actually you give people the false sense of security that they're complying with everything. And that's my concern, is that if we abbreviate things to cover it all, then you're going to think, right, this is it, this is everything I need to cover in this document, and that you're far from it. So.
Okay, Mark?
That's something referred to in your evidence, but how should complaints procedures be accommodated within the code and the best practice?
We believe that there should be, complaints procedures are covered in the codes for the letting agents when they're a member of a professional body. And I will reiterate, I fully support David on the basis that we thought that the agents should be a member of a professional body as part of this Act. But there's nothing currently there for landlords. Now, it's a bit more difficult for landlords because obviously there's not necessarily a redress scheme or there's not many people in an organisation that you can escalate complaints to. So you have to be a bit careful because you can't assume the same availability of a redress scheme as is available for letting agents. But we think that there should be both a complaints procedure and a repairs reporting procedure, which ties into the retaliatory eviction side of things in terms for the Renting Homes Bill, so that both parties are aware of what's expected when a complaint is made or a repair obligation is made. And I'm not saying it should tie people down to the moment they make one little mistake, then that's it, they've failed the process and they can have things awarded against them. But giving the guidance around, well, when this happens, you should be doing this. And it allows education on both sides then, because you can say to the tenant, well, if you have an issue and if something's not being repaired, have you followed this procedure? Because if you follow this procedure, then you'll more easily get things done. And it will take a while, but through education and training, we can get this out into the sector.
And clarity for tenants.
Yes, and clarity for tenants.
Well, from the agent perspective, it actually goes back to what was on the face of the Act itself. There was no requirement for complaints procedure for a letting agent in the Act, which is startling. But at the moment, there should be an internal, as far as we're concerned, there should be an internal complaints procedure within an agency. When that has been exhausted, there should be independent redress through an ombudsman service. And then we take the view with our members, if the Ombudsman upholds a complaint against them, we have an entirely independent disciplinary tribunal that will then act on the member themselves and can impose fines, additional training and termination. But of course termination from our membership doesn't remove them from the industry. They can still practice as a letting agent. And therefore there does need to be a robust complaints procedure. But what was in the bill was then taken out of the bill, and therefore at the moment it's 6 months in England that all agents have to be a member of a redress scheme. There is no such requirement in Wales at the moment, and unless something changes, there is no requirement going forward either.
Just got a few more minutes, but I know Alan does more to come in. Gwyn, did you have a few questions, and then John?
Yes, just on the best practice. Whether it's clear to you the impact of the best practice section will be monitored. Is it clear how it's going to be monitored? And whether the issue of electrical safety checks, smoke and carbon monoxide detectors should be addressed through the best practice section or made statutory requirement, for example, by amendment to the Rented Homes Bill.
Monitoring, there's been no proposal so far. We've had no information as to how really this is going to be monitored and enforced. I'm equally as keen to learn about that as you are. In terms of property standards, well, as far as the purpose of this Act, the Housing Wales Act, was really around lettings and management standards, as opposed to property conditions. There's an entire section on property condition in the Renting Homes Wales Bill, and I think that actually that's where we should focus on property conditions, and not in a code of practice, because that's how you do things as opposed to what is the property.
Yep, I would agree with Douglas entirely on that one. I would say in England we've got mandatory requirement for smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors where solid fuel is burnt, coming into force on the 1st of October. It is probably sensible to replicate that. I might actually suggest that you go a little bit further, because nobody's quite sure why England stopped at only solid fuel, why they didn't include gas and oil and LPG. Again, we've asked DCRG and they've not really provided us with any clarity on that one. But I would imagine that carbon monoxide from gas appliances is probably more prevalent to kill than coal.
What about the electrical safety checks? It's suggested every 5 years a property should be revisited.
We in principle agree with electrical safety checks. So what my objection wasn't that I didn't want them to happen. I just don't think that the code of practice is the right place for them to occur or to be mandated. We agree with electrical safety checks, but not necessarily every 5 years. I think that should be an advisory of 5 years on the basis of what the electrician goes in and says. So if you've got a low risk property, and it's a new installation, then really you should be looking at longer than that. If you've got a higher risk property, then they might turn around and say every 2 or 3 years. I think if you look at every other part of the industry, you're going on to, in terms of assessing the risk, to start really mandating time periods when the time period isn't necessary. It's something that I think we should examine.
Michael Allen, then Peter on this point.
Well, you do that with gas, of course. Every year you need a certificate, and I think that's right and proper for the reason that Mr. Cox has referred to. And it appears to me that if you say you want to have, you've got no objection to an electrical safety test, which is a very reasonable point of view to take, but it's difficult then to say that you do have objections to doing that in a structured way. You know, my view is that if you don't have a structure for that testing and certification, and 5 years to me seems a reasonable period of time, except it could be shorter, but certainly shouldn't be longer, then that provides the certainty and the guarantees that people require. And I'd be surprised. I'm assuming you don't want this in this code of conduct, and you'd have the same objection probably if it were to go on into primary legislation.
Well, in terms of having mandatory electrical safety systems put into primary legislation, I'm not sure that that's the right place to put them into primary legislation, but
so where is it?
That's well in regulations that come afterwards. So, but as far as I'm concerned, an electrician is trained to be able to tell me what the status of that property is in, and I'm not going to prejudge his competency other than by checking that he's got the right levels of certificate. So therefore, I want to... Sorry, apologies. That electrician's...
Well, your electrician might be male.
My electrician is male, yes. My decorator is female. My electrician is male. So therefore, I rely on the expertise of an electrician, because whilst I know a little bit about electrics, I certainly wouldn't start playing around with it or pretend that I can tell you how often that needs to be tested. And if 10 years is appropriate for some new installations, then I will rely on the electrician to tell me that.
Peter, you had...
2 points. I mean, David, when you talked about the mandatory requirements in terms of solid fuel appliances, you said, I thought I heard you say CO detectors and smoke detectors.
Smoke detectors, in England the law is, the law will be, I should say, that you require a smoke detector on every floor of every property.
Right, yeah, okay, that's a separate thing, yeah.
And a carbon monoxide detector in every
With
room
a solid
where
fuel
a
plant,
solid fuel is
so the smoke detector is slightly different.
Smoke detector, sorry, two different requirements.
On the electrical safety checks, I think the issue, I mean, obviously you have to make sure the electricity supply and the fixed supply and the reduced supply are safe. But of course, a tenant can introduce a electrical device at any stage, which could be faulty, which could cause a fire. I'm just wondering, how do you manage that process?
I think it's almost impossible to manage that process. You can tell tenants what they should do, that they shouldn't overload sockets. But I think when we talk about electrical safety certificate tests, we're talking about the wiring of the property itself. It's why there should be PAT testing, portable appliance testing for anything that the landlord has in the property. It is very difficult to tell tenants what they can and can't put, because it is their home.
Of course,
it's their choice what they bring in. Now, particularly for people coming from abroad using international adapters and then attaching a television, a games console, a laptop, 3 or 4 lights all onto one, and then using an international adapter is the most dangerous and one of the commonest causes of fires in student houses. But there's a level of, you can take the horse to water, but you can't make it drink, and things like that.
So when we're talking about electrical testing, we're talking about checking the electrics are safe and any goods which you supply as a landlord are PAT tested.
I mean, for us, we think RCDs are actually one of the most important parts of that. And that's what we would like to see, because ultimately then if the appliance is faulty, then actually the RCD will protect you. And if the tenant wants to do the Christmas tree situation, then you've got some level of protection there. So that's the sort of thing that we would support. But on inspections, you can talk to a tenant and say you can't have 17 different strip plugs with things plugged into it, and you can make them take them out reasonably under the grounds of safety. But the moment you leave, they'll just plug them back in again.
And that's actually the same problem with smoke alarms. The law in England is that the smoke alarm will have to work at the start of the tenancy. Now, one of the common problems, one of the common objections by the industry to a mandatory smoke alarm is, what if the tenant just takes the battery out at the moment?
They should be hardwired, shouldn't they? They should be hardwired.
In a lot of properties, it's quite difficult. Certainly in any new build, they come hardwired. But in a lot of older properties, that is quite a challenge. And particularly, the law in England is going to require on every floor. So, for example, if you've got a 2-storey property above a chip shop, it's going to need 3 because the entrance will be at chip shop level, and you'll have to go up that first set of stairs. And again, it kind of comes back to the horse to water. You can put it in, you can make sure it works. If the tenant, same argument with light bulbs actually. If the tenant doesn't change the light bulb, there's nothing the landlord or the agent can do. If the tenant doesn't change the battery in the smoke alarm or deliberately takes the battery out of the smoke alarm to use it in something else, there's very little the landlord can do, because it's the tenant's home during the tenancy.
But hardwired is doable. Now, I've got a 100-year-old house and I've hardwired my smoke alarm in there. It's just investment.
Should I do that?
Okay, well, John, you had a final question?
Yeah, just on enforcement, Chair, which you've touched upon already, really. Do you think it would be a good idea to include the penalties for landlords and agents in the code in terms of effective enforcement?
I can't see it hurting, but we do want to make sure that the code doesn't get too long. And a lot of what we talked about today comes down to the issue of enforcement. How is this going to be enforced? Now, at no point throughout the entire process of this bill up to today have we heard anything from the Welsh Government about how they're going to enforce it. Now, it's imposing an awful lot of requirements. One of the things I actually raised at a conference in Cardiff a few weeks ago under the proposals for how they're going to regulate the scheme is, I don't think the government has fully appreciated the sheer volume of administration work they are going to have to do. Just to give you an example, I have 8,000 members. I have quite restrictive requirements on my members. I employ 27 full-time staff just to make sure that my members comply with my requirements. And I only make them do it on an annual basis and to confirm. In Wales and under the licensing proposals, if a member of staff in an agency leaves, for example, the agency that they're leaving will need to notify the Welsh Government that the member of staff is leaving. They will then need to notify the Welsh Government again that a new member of staff has come in to replace the leaving member of staff. The company that that member of staff is going to will need to notify the Welsh Government that that member of staff is coming, and probably have to notify the Welsh Government that a previous member of staff has left. So for one staff change, that's 4 notifications to the Welsh Government, which all have to be done within 28 days of the action happening. Every landlord that moves a portfolio from one agent to another agent, every single property in that portfolio, they will need to notify the Welsh Government that they're leaving agent X, and then notify the Welsh Government again that then they're joining agent Y. These sheer administrative requirements, I don't think, have been appreciated at all. And with the best will in the world, they are going to need an army of staff to be able to actually comply with the requirements they have set themselves. And I really do not think they have appreciated quite what they have set themselves up to do. And I'm worried that they have actually set themselves up to fail. Because unless they employ hundreds of staff, they are not going to manage what they have put in their own documents. And then that comes down to enforcement. If they're spending catastrophic sums of money on administering the scheme, what is left for enforcement? How is enforcement going to work? And it's the same with every scheme that we have seen of this kind, that the administrative requirements have been way higher than they've ever expected, and therefore they've never got around to the enforcement. Sorry if that was a bit of a negative to finish on.
I think it's
anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's an example of how they've just not understood the agent market at all, and they've tacked it onto landlords. And actually, really, what they should have done is looked at agents, sort that out, understand that, put everything in place, and then filter it down to landlords. And you would have had a much bigger impact by focusing on agents on the market anyway. But in terms of your point, yes, I think it should be highlighted. I think actually there should be a bit more communication in that document, not reams and reams, something quite simple to say, this is your code of practice, this is what you should be following. If you do not follow this, then you can lose your code, you can lose your license. If you lose your license, you may be in a position where you cannot actually operate or manage your portfolio anymore. And I think that needs to be made very clear. One of the other things I would like to see, and I'd really like the committee to consider, and we have requested this via the civil servants, is that actually going forwards, it was discussed, but it seems to have, the focus seems to have changed on it, but is that actually after this starts, that there is a stakeholder panel that supervises and measures and monitors the performance of the scheme, both in terms of financially operating and it's actually having an effective measure on the industry with the right metrics put in place, and metrics that are agreed by the stakeholders, not just the metrics that the government thinks represent the best outcome for the scheme.
I would wholeheartedly support that one. I know that a task group or working group has been set up that involves the Welsh Government and local authorities, but it's actually it's not the local authorities that are going to be dealing with this on the ground, it's the agents and the landlords. Yep. So there should be some representation.
And we're paying for the scheme, so...
May I make one final point on the code? The code needs to be a living document. Law changes, case law, legislation changes, so if it is going to be set in stone, it needs some mechanism to be updated as law changes. Otherwise, what has happened with the 2002 rent-only code will happen with this, and the moment the Renting Homes Bill gets passed, this may become completely obsolete. So it needs to be a living document. Okay, well that's very, very helpful. Can I thank both of you for attending and giving, obviously your views on this. This is very helpful for us. We will send you a transcript of the meeting so you can check for any inaccuracies. Okay?
No problem. Thank you,
And I'd now like to invite our next panel. Thank you very much both anyway.